Welcome everybody. The aim today is to give you a flavour of what studying international politics would be like at Middlesex University. My name's Peter Huff. I'm an Associate Professor of International Politics here. I've been based at the university for many years. I teach on the undergrad programme and also on our master's programme, the MA International Relations. My purpose is not to talk about the programme itself, but to, as I say, to give you a flavour of the kind of things that we cover. But just so you're aware, the BA International Politics, which I teach upon, is a course that you can take in different ways. You could also do it as an international politics with law degree, or in politics, law and economics. So it's it's a course you can take which allows you to specialize in different areas. The common theme, however, of course, is international politics, which is very much my area. So what I want to talk about in this lecture is, of course, something pretty topical. When I was asked if I could do this session, I was thinking to myself, what should I cover? I guess, even though you have seen plenty of this in the news, we can't really escape thinking a little bit about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that means. How can we understand that? How can we put that in context? And just to be clear, in studying a subject like international politics, obviously we're interested in current affairs. We're interested in events as they happen. They inform our teaching, they inform our curriculum. But we're trying to do more than simply describe what's happening. So what I'm going to do today, and what you would get on the program, is not simply a case of going through the maps and showing the points of incursion of the Russians and thinking about the casualty figures. It's more trying to set that in some sort of overall context. How can we understand the war? What can we learn from the war? What does it tell us about the conduct of international affairs? And of course, a prominent question that always gets asked is, does this signify a new Cold War? My area of specialism is security politics. And as such, even though this is a lecture I've put together specifically for this occasion, this is, hopefully a way in which I can draw upon a number of themes that I cover in my teaching, and indeed I cover in my research. I've written a number of books in this area, but most notably, I suppose, a textbook, Understanding Global Security. I'm currently working on the 5th edition of that. So is it a new Cold War? Well, in thinking about that, of course, a number of questions come to mind. We, of course, can think about this in different kinds of ways. In thinking about this fundamental question, is it a new Cold War? Well, of course, on the one hand, we could answer, well, yes. This is a return to how politics on the international stage were being carried out roughly between 1949 and 1989. The reason I say roughly, I'll come on to a little bit later on. So yes, on the one hand, you could say, well, this is going back to, times I can certainly remember. And, if you've spoken to your parents or older family members, they can possibly remember too. On the other hand, we could suggest, no, it's not. Obviously it's a crisis. Obviously we're horrified by some of the things that we see on our TV screens, but at the end of the day, maybe the stakes aren't as high as they were during the 50s, 60s, or the 1980s in particular. So a third position, of course, however, is to look at this somewhat differently and say, well, actually, maybe the Cold War never ended. Maybe suggesting the Cold War came to an end in 1989 is too simplistic, and what we're actually witnessing is a continuation of great power rivalry that's been going on, not only in the context of relations between Russia and their allies and the US and their allies, but much deeper than that as well. So a third sort of perspective is to say this is all nothing new. This is a continuation of rivalry between powers that we've seen throughout history. So there are kind of, in a fundamental way, three different takes that you could make on this. So in terms of thinking about this question of, are we in a new Cold War? I'm going to start off by talking about, firstly, well, what was, if you like, the original Cold War? what was the Cold War? As I say, I'm old enough to remember it, but many of you might not be, entirely familiar with the the ins and outs of the Cold War. But of course, in considering whether we are entering a new Cold War, we do need to examine, well, what was the Cold War to start with that we are supposedly re-entering? So I'll examine what the Cold War was, provide you with historiography of the Cold War, think about different perspectives explaining the Cold War, particularly why it started, and also look at different phases of the Cold War. I'm not going to go into detail, but give you a sort of historical overview of how the Cold War evolved, which again, I think is useful for understanding the situation that we find ourselves in today. After that, I'll proceed to give an overview of Russian foreign policy. What are the characteristics of Russian foreign policy? What kinds of factors can we see, not just over recent weeks or months, but over a long historical span? What kind of factors influence Russian foreign policy making? And do they offer us any useful insights into understanding the invasion of Ukraine? So are we facing a new Cold War? So let's start then by examining the Cold War. What was the Cold War? There's an image on the screen there of Khrushchev and Kennedy at the height of the Cold War in the early 1960s. Cold War is a curious term in many ways. It was popularized in the late 1940s by an American journalist called Walter Lippmann. And it was characterized to think about how there had been a marked deterioration in relations between the US and what was then the USSR, the Soviet Union, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, to give its full title. Because of course the US and the USSR had fought together during the Second World War. But by the end of the 1940s, they were, apparently very much in a rival position. But the idea of Cold War was to distinguish this confrontation from a hot war. So of course, the US and the USSR never went to war with each other directly during the Cold War. There were lots of indirect conflicts, or what are sometimes referred to as proxy wars, which you may or may not know about, but they never fought directly. So it wasn't a conventional conflict. It wasn't a war like the Second World War or the First World War or Napoleonic Wars, where great powers came directly into collision with each other. So as a way of characterizing a period of hostility without outright war. It actually wasn't the first time the term had been used. We can go back many, many centuries to the application of this in relation to Spain's relations with a number of Muslim countries. A lot of Islamic forces took over a large part of Spain. But there was a period in their history in the 14th to 15th century where there was not outright war, but there was a degree of hostility. So Lippmann was drawing upon historical examples of antagonism between countries without there being an actual conflict. Now, I mentioned 1949 as a starting point, and the reason we can't be entirely precise about that, I'll kind of come on to shortly, but the reason 1949 is sometimes suggested to be the start point of the Cold War is because that marked the launch of what became known as the Truman Doctrine. Truman was the American president, succeeded Roosevelt towards the end of the Second World War. And he was marked by a more hostile position towards the Soviet Union than had been the case under Roosevelt. Now, obviously, during the Second World War, the Americans and the Russians, had a lot of differences, ideologically. But Roosevelt and Stalin formed a reasonable relationship. Roosevelt referred to him as Uncle Joe in a sort of jovial manner. We can't overplay this. There were obviously huge differences between the Americans and the Soviets, and indeed between the British under Churchill and the Soviets. But of course, they had a common enemy, Nazi Germany. Truman, however, very much influenced by George Kennan, who was a US ambassador to the Soviet Union during the Second World War, was very influential in convincing Truman that Stalin and the Soviets were not just being rhetorical when they spoke about supporting wars of revolution, which is the kind of Marxist rhetoric of supporting other like-minded causes around the world. So in Kennan's view, once the Second World War was over, the Soviets would be, looking to expand into Asia and into Eastern Europe, which I'll come on to a little bit later on. So the Truman Doctrine indicated that the US were going to take a proactive line in their foreign policy in a way that we hadn't necessarily seen before. The doctrine itself was launched in relation to a very specific event, the Civil War in Greece. And it indicated that the US would bankroll support of the government resisting leftist insurgency in Greece. Now, this was symbolic in a couple of ways. Firstly, because initially that was a role that the British were meant to play. The British had been the guarantor of Greece against leftist insurgency. But by 1949, the British were in no position to do this, having been very much weakened by the Second World War economically. And also indicated that the US were prepared to get involved in other countries in a way that they generally been reluctant to for some period of time. Of course, they'd entered the Second World War and the First World War when they felt compelled to. But in between, in the 20s and 30s, the US had conducted a foreign policy of isolationism, keeping out of international affairs if they could possibly help it. It was an approach which Donald Trump talked about as president, and to some extent tried to get involved, not getting involved in international affairs, America first, as he put it. So the Truman Doctrine represented a very different sort of shift in US foreign policy. Also, 1949 saw the launch of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance, of course, the US, Canada, and several Western European countries, which was established in order to counter Soviet expansionism. So that seemed to draw the lines in terms of this new kind of confrontation, ideological confrontation. I think there was a question there, so I'll just see if there's okay, I'll take that at the end. So as I said, I'm going to look at the Cold War in terms of what's called a historiography. A historiography is when you examine different historical schools of thought. Because, of course, with most major events, there are different interpretations. And of course, the job of historians is to look at competing perspectives on that. And indeed, it's the job of international politics scholars as well to look at events from different perspectives, appraise them from different angles, appreciate different perspectives. When you study something like international politics, it isn't just a case of, we tell you the facts and you accept them. It's understanding that there are different ways of characterizing what goes on in the world. There's no one single truth. There are lots of different interpretations. Your job as a scholar, if you like, as well as our jobs as lecturers, is to interpret that and reach our own conclusions. So in terms of the Cold War, essentially speaking, we can talk about three schools of thought. Now, obviously, you could go into depth and suggest that there are more. But broadly speaking, we can talk about three perspectives on why the Cold War started. Why did we move from cooperation between the Soviets and the Americans and their allies, the Second World War, to this period of heightened hostility at the end of the 1940s? The traditionalist perspective, and the term traditionalist here is traditionalist from a Western point of view. Yeah, if you were, giving this lecture in Russia, of course, the traditionalist perspective would be a more Russian inclined perspective. But a traditional Western perspective, epitomized by the likes of the historians Feiss or Schlesinger, is essentially to blame the Soviet Union. In line with what I said earlier about George Kennan, believing that the Soviets had ill intent towards the West. The wartime alliance was a marriage of convenience. Once that's out of the way, Soviet tanks would be rolling into Poland, Romania, wherever else, that they considered there was a desire to extend their influence or to further the cause of Marxist revolution. So the traditionalist perspective contends that when Truman launched the doctrine in 1949, this was just the Americans responding in a rational, defensive manner, responding to Soviet aggression, dealing with it in the way that, they considered necessary. And that remains the kind of orthodoxy, I suppose, if we are to think about the Cold War from an American or a Western type perspective. But of course, there are many other views. Revisionists, in this context, a revisionist means revising the traditional perspective. So you'll get this in any kind of body of history. A traditionalist camp will set out one story, a revisionist camp will try to challenge it. In this context, the revisionists are skeptical, if you like, of the Western Orthodox position on this. And this includes many scholars from the West, such as the Polkos, a pair of brothers, I think, and Lefebvre and others. And to put it simplistically, they essentially reverse the conventional wisdom and blame the Cold War on the Americans. And their argument is the Cold War occurred not through Soviet aggression, but through American aggression. And they cite various forms of evidence for this, some of which you might have thought about if you've studied history before or you've got an interest in history. For instance, there is the argument that when the Americans dropped the atomic bombs on Japan in 1945, they did so with an eye on Moscow as much as an eye on Tokyo. Evidence that's used to support that is, for example, the Soviets weren't informed by the Americans that they were going to do this. That is an established fact. That's not an opinion. So, Truman didn't inform, the Americans didn't inform the Soviet Union, which might seem surprising given that they were wartime allies. And indeed, the Soviets had declared war on Japan earlier that year as well. So although their alliance was more to do with Germany, they were allies in the Japanese context as well. So the argument there is obviously the logic of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that it was to subdue Japanese opposition. And we can, there's obviously a whole debate to be had there, but that's, there's a logic within that the Japanese weren't going to surrender and needed something extreme. But there's also the argument this was deliberately to show the Soviet Union that the Americans had this huge preponderance in military capability that the Soviets, of course, didn't have. So it was a kind of a marker for, the future, once the Second World War is over, is going to be dictated by us. A further argument used by revisionists is to suggest the Cold War didn't start in 1949. It had been going on for some time. And again, there's an argument here that the Second World War alliance was a marriage of convenience, but in a different way. So revisionists point out that there had always been hostility to the Soviet Union from the West, going back right to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, when, of course, the British, the Americans, the French, and others supported the White Russians, the monarchists, against the Bolsheviks. So there's an argument there that there had always been Western hostility to the Soviet Union, and to Russia before that as well, quite conceivably. This had been covered over for a while during the Second World War because of the common threat of Nazi Germany, but this was just a return to normal. So revisionists essentially blame the Americans and argue that faced with the Americans launching the Truman Doctrine, the NATO being launched, the responses to that by the Soviets were purely defensive. Faced with that, the Soviets felt they had to develop their own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. They had to construct their own sphere of influence. They had to defend themselves against aggression from the West. So in terms of taking this up to the present day, hopefully, you get where I'm coming from here. A lot of what Putin is saying is, something we can perhaps comprehend within this kind of framework. The need for a sphere of influence, the view that NATO is, by its very nature, an anti-Russian and threatening alliance. So traditionalists blame the Soviets, revisionists blame the Americans, but there is a third school of thought, post-revisionists. This is interesting, particularly from an international relations point of view, because that's where I'm coming from, international relations or international politics. I'm not really a historian, but of course, I and my discipline are, of course, very much interested in history. The third school of thought, which John Gaddis is perhaps the best example, looks at this somewhat differently. It looks at it from the perspective of what are known as the realists in international relations, which I'll say a little bit more about shortly. And this is a view that the Cold War was essentially nothing to do with capitalism or communism, which is how it would typically be characterized. Communist Soviet Union, capitalist United States and their allies coming into confrontation. For Gaddis, it was nothing to do with ideology. It was all about power. The end of the Second World War had created a power vacuum. Because, of course, if you think about it, the world had changed dramatically in a geopolitical sense. Before the Second World War, Western Europe could be understood as the focus of power in the world. Germany, France, Britain, perhaps the sort of, premier military powers. But that changed, of course, very rapidly. Germany was essentially no more. France had been occupied through most of the war, so essentially was starting again as a country. Britain had ended the war victorious, of course, but as I mentioned earlier, significantly weakened. So there was a vacuum. All of a sudden, there was a shift in power. And for realists, when this happened, something will fill the vacuum in the same way as it would occur in natural science. So in 1945, all of a sudden, you had the US and the USSR emerging as the world's premier powers. And from a realist perspective, inevitably, that will lead to those premier powers vying for supremacy. And the point Gaddis makes is it doesn't really make the difference whether they were both capitalists or both communists. As the world's premier powers, they were bound to come into collision. So this is stripping the Cold War free of ideology and arguing it's just a power struggle. And that's important for comprehending international relations in a more general sense. So Gaddis epitomized a realist perspective in international relations. The realists became the dominant school of thought in IR around the same time as the Cold War. So, towards the end of the Second World War. Hans Morgenthau, Politics Among Nations is a great example. George Kennan, who I mentioned earlier, who was a diplomat, became an academic as well. And that line of thinking was very much on the basis of power, and balance or an imbalance of power is essentially what determines international affairs. Before the Second World War, international relations as a discipline had been dominated by liberalism. Liberalism in an international relations sense is not entirely the same thing as liberalism in a political ideology sense, but there's a lot of commonality. In international relations, liberals believe in international law and in international organizations. So, of course, as you might know, at the end of the First World War, the League of Nations had been created, and that was very much molded in the ethos of liberalism. Let's resolve disputes through the rule of law and through international organizations and open diplomacy. But of course, the League of Nations failed, and we had a Second World War. And the realists' argument was, well, that shows you law and organizations don't work. The only way you can have order in the world is the use of force. The only way Nazi Germany was defeated was by countries putting aside their differences, working together and fighting them. So this is, you know, an approach, realism, which believes liberalism is unrealistic. In fact, that's where the term realism comes from. You could argue it's quite a pretentious title, saying we're the pragmatic, sensible, realist ones. The liberals are the, you know, the idealists, the utopians, the wishful thinkers. And of course, if you think about it, that sort of debate between people who believe you can solve conflicts through reason and law and debate versus those who think you can't, is something that we still see very much characterizing how people think about the world today and, you know, the Ukraine crisis. Okay, another thing to always bear in mind with the Cold War is it wasn't uniform as a conflict. It went through different phases. In particular, most, if not all, historians will talk about two Cold Wars, even though we perhaps, you know, think of that as a period of conflict. It was a period when there was more or less tension between East and West. So the first Cold War, depending whether you think it started in 45 or 49, went up to about the end of the 1960s. And at this point, the US called the shots. Because although the Soviet Union developed their own atomic weapon in 1949, they were always playing catch up. They were always well behind the Americans. So in the early points of confrontation, such as the standoff over the status of West Berlin, the end of the 1940s, it was essentially the West that won. So hence the West were able to maintain a role in West Berlin, even though the Soviets controlled the rest of Eastern Germany. However, things changed moving into the 1960s because the Soviets caught up. So the Cuban Missile Crisis in particular in 1962 characterized a turning point. As I say, you know, if you talk to elder relatives about the Cold War, perhaps if they are trying to describe a point of particular fear, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Before my time even, but a lot of people genuinely felt that the World War was inevitable at that point. Cuban Missile Crisis occurred when the Soviet Union tried to station nuclear weapons on Cuba, which, as you can imagine, the Americans weren't too keen on. The Americans managed to convince them to withdraw them, which led a lot of people to characterize this as an American victory, a victory for Kennedy. But it actually overlooks the fact that as a quid pro quo, as the other side of the deal, the Americans had to remove their weapons from Turkey. So it actually marked a point when there was a balance between the Soviet Union and the US. So when people talk about a balance of power, it was in the 60s that a balance set in. The Soviets and the Americans pretty much matched each other in weaponry. And this allowed the logic of the balance of terror, as it became referred to set in. The logic that both sides were deterred from attacking the other because they knew if they did, it would lead to their inevitable destruction. Now, we still see that logic today. The Russians today in the US have a roughly equal number of nuclear weapons, even though in a wider sense, the Americans have clear superiority in military capability. But that's very much a legacy of this period of the Cold War. So what this meant was it was possible to have arms control agreements. And this is where the logic of realism set in. Realists believe you can have order with a balance of power. The Soviets and the Americans matched each other. Therefore, they had an incentive not to start war. Okay. The logic of mutually assured destruction. For either side to have initiated war would have been at the cost of their own destruction. It was underpinned by the idea of second strike capability, which meant both sides had enough weapons, not only to wipe the other side out, but to wipe the other side out after they've attempted to wipe them out, which is why there was a major escalation in weapons So there were far, far more nuclear weapons in the world then than there are now, for example. But because they were balanced out, from a realist point of view, that created order. And a realist will tell you the Cold War was a period of order, at least from the 1960s onwards, because there was this balance. The fact that the Soviets and the Americans then entered into negotiations and agreed to arms control arrangements such as the strategic arms limitation talks ushered in a period of détente. Okay, a French term meaning not the complete end of conflict, but a reduction in conflict and an improvement in relations. And the 1970s was a period when many people imagined the Cold War was coming to an end. Of course, the Americans had been involved in Vietnam, but they, obviously failed there and had pulled out in the mid-70s. Americans improved relations with the Chinese in the early 70s. Things improved. They started to trade with each other. And it was widely imagined the Cold War was actually coming to an end. They were entering into a period of what was called coexistence. They were going to be ideologically different. They were going to have conflicts of interest, but they could get on. They had a mutual interest in working together. But of course, it didn't last. 1979, it came to an abrupt end because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which prompted the Second Cold War. The Soviets believed Afghanistan was in their sphere of influence, and they didn't imagine it would upset the West, but it did. And Ronald Reagan, when he became president of the US, very much upped the ante, spoke about the USSR as the focus of all evil in the modern world, and the evil empire. The Americans greatly increased arms expenditure. They ripped up the arms control agreements that they had with the Soviet Union. And eventually, this pressure told. And the Soviet Union simply couldn't keep up with the Americans anymore. In the mid-80s, Gorbachev became president in the Soviet Union, and he looked to end the Cold War. He looked to improve relations with the West. And that, of course, brought the Cold War to an end. Now, I mentioned that the timeline of the Cold War is loose, and as well as this referring to the point that we can't be certain about when it started, for the kind of reasons I got into earlier, it's also not that easy to say when it ended. Basically, it sort of, faded away through the late 1980s. This was a meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan at Reykjavik in Iceland. I think it was 86. And this was a series of meetings which gradually improved relations. They opened up more trade with each other, made agreement to cooperate on environmental issues and other issues, culminating 1989 in the Paris Treaty, which officially consigned the Cold War to history. Both the Soviet Union and the US put their names to a document saying the Cold War was over. Then, of course, a couple of years later, the Soviet Union itself broke up into Russia, Ukraine, and 13 other states, which seemed to sort of, mark the culmination of this. And you may well have seen some of the images of this. Again, if you talk to older relatives, I'm sure they'll have told you about the celebrations in '89 when the Cold War was over, the Iron Curtain came down, Berlin was reunited, a period of, great optimism and rejoicing. But an important point here, which I'll come back to, is that because the Cold War wasn't an ordinary war, this ending was not typical either. Usually, of course, a major war ends with a very detailed settlement. Yeah. Second World War, First World War, Napoleonic Wars, they all ended with a very significant settlement. Germany was occupied at the end of the Second World War. The Versailles settlement redrew the map of Europe. At the end of the First World War, France was occupied at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. That didn't happen at the end of the Cold War. The document they signed was very brief. It didn't go into any detail. It didn't discuss, how exactly relations would be. Right? It was just a sort of, celebratory, yes, it's over, here's to a new future. And, there are arguments now that, maybe it's easy with hindsight, we could have done with a little bit more detail in this, but such was the celebratory mood that the Cold War was simply consigned to history. Of course, what we're then left with is, well, if the Cold War ended then, how come we've still had sources of tension leading up to, where we are today with the Russian incursion into Ukraine? Well, look, this opens up questions about the nature of Russian foreign policy, which I'll now come on to, which to some extent perhaps came to be overlooked in the celebratory atmosphere of the 1990s. I've got a question there, which I'm happy to take before I move on. So Peter's asked, hi, taking that post-revisionist view of why the Cold War came to be, could you apply that to Ukraine, Russia today, and that Russia felt time was right because US isn't as powerful or even a decade ago? Yeah, absolutely. I'll come on to that shortly, actually, but a lot of realists and a lot of people from that post-revisionist perspective will make that very point. A good example you could look at is John Mearsheimer, a very prominent realist thinker, who make the point that we kind of overlooked, or we in the West kind of overlooked this, and that it's actually not altogether surprising that Russia would, as you indicate, sort of maybe wait till the time is right and then look to reassert themselves. So yes, it's a very good question you pose, and I think many would argue that. Mearsheimer is recently on record as sort of making that very point, that although obviously in a direct sense the blame for the war in Ukraine lies squarely with Putin and the Russians, nevertheless perhaps the West have ultimately antagonized them by not addressing sources of concern which have always been there. So there was a period of better relations, of course, between Russia following the break of the Soviet Union in 91 and the West in the early 90s under President Yeltsin. They cooperated together before the break of the Soviet Union in terms of the Gulf War. The Soviet Union didn't take part in the Gulf War against Iraq for the invasion of Kuwait, but they backed it in the UN. Economic ties greatly improved through the 90s, but there were always sources of antagonism, which would ultimately, come back to the fore. So this opens up a question about the nature of Russian foreign policy, which I'll now come on to. Start with this map here. Obvious point, Russia's very big. But this size of the country, and of course its military capabilities, perhaps distracts us to a point that from a Russian perspective, there's always been a sense of vulnerability about themselves as a country. Because particularly in the western part of the country, on the, of course, the border now with Ukraine, we're talking about a wide open plain in geographical senses. And of course, historically, that's where Russians have been vulnerable. The French under Napoleon attacked them, the Germans under Hitler attacked them. So there's always been a preoccupation with defending themselves in the West. And we can certainly, to some extent, understand their attitude towards Ukraine in that regards. So there's always been a sense of vulnerability, and at the same time, there's always been certain continuities in Russian foreign policy, which I'll come on to. I think there's another question in the Q&A, which I'll look at. Oh no, that was the same one, was it? Okay. So what traditional characteristics are there of Russian foreign policy? Well, academics of Russian foreign policy will invariably look at certain common themes. And by this, I mean not just themes that we can understand Putin's policy, but we can understand under the communist era and indeed before that under the Tsars. Firstly, secure warm water ports. go back to that map at the start, of course, a lot of the Russian coastline is frozen, the northern Arctic coastline, and so has limited utility in terms of naval power. So the ability to be able to access ports in the Baltic and the Black Sea has always been a preoccupation. So this was a source of great rivalry, for example, between the British and the Russians in the 19th century. And of course, we can see that very much in the current context with, if you look at how the Russian focus now is very much appears to be on the Black Sea and securing access. That's this so-called idea of a corridor through to Crimea. But of course, we should remember before the war, the Russians had annexed Crimea Peninsula, which is stuck right in the middle of the Black Sea, and even before that, they'd already got agreement from Ukraine that they could base their navy in the Black Sea, even though at that point that was essentially Ukrainian sea rather than Russian sea. So that's a long-running theme. The second one, a sphere of influence. I've already made some allusions to this. Russian foreign policy has always been, if you wanted to be critical paranoid, if you wanted to be more revisionist, you'd say perhaps rationally apprehensive of Western domination, believing that they need a sphere of influence. It's natural that Russia would form links with countries in its orbit, as it would see it. And of course, Ukraine very much fits that bill. Many people in Ukraine speak Russian, and there's a long-standing cultural and historical linkage between them. Indeed, the origins of the idea of Russian identity, the Rus, originates around Kiev and Ukraine rather than Moscow and St. Petersburg. Pan-Slavism is a term that's been used to characterize Russian foreign policy for a long period of time. The idea of Slavs together, Ukrainians, Belarusians, as well as Poles and some others from West Central Europe are Slavs. They're all, brothers in that sense. So there's an idea of a common bond there. And that's something that, of course, was very much apparent during the communist era, when, of course, the Soviet Union essentially controlled much of Slavic Europe. But of course, we can see that in many ways, Putin is attempting to maintain that. And of course, famously, he talked about the end of the Cold War as the greatest geopolitical disaster in Russian history. But indeed, as I'll come on to, the sphere of influence idea was around even before the communist era. In Tsarist Russia, the Russians, saw themselves as having, a special relationship. It led in the early 20th century, for example, to incursions into Serbia and Bulgaria to, as they would see it, save them from Turkish oppression. Oh, sorry, I've skipped through a little bit. Linked to that, resisting Western encroachment. So as I say, particularly in reference to the revisionist perspective on the Cold War, there's often been a perception that the West is hostile. And this isn't just an anti-communist thing. As I say, the Russians have a perception that there's always been hostility to them. The West has never really seen them as on the same side. As I say, the British were very hostile to the 19th century. It's a kind of a running theme. And of course, we can perhaps understand where that sentiment would come from if we think about, how the Nazis sent troops into Russia, into the Soviet Union, despite apparently having formed a military alliance with them, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1940, or indeed, as I say, Napoleon in the early 19th century. So there's often been a view that they need to resist themselves against Western encroachment. So here again, we can understand the logic of seeing NATO as inherently threatening. Now, of course, the Americans and their allies have always been keen to point out that NATO isn't an anti-Russian alliance. But the bottom line is, of course, that it was set up as an anti-Russian alliance, and it's still there. And even though NATO is about, or has been about, a lot more than Russia, of course, if you think about it, a lot of the countries that have joined it, over the years have done so essentially to secure themselves from Russian domination. This is the main motivation for the Baltic states or Poland or Hungary to join, for example. I've got a question from Nicole. Is another reason why they feel vulnerable because they still have this vision of the USSR, which was taken away from them? Yeah, Nicole, that's a very good point, very good observation. I think that's right. Again, I think one of the dangers is from a Western point of view, we of course celebrate the end of the Soviet Union. But from a Russian point of view, the end of the Soviet Union was, for a lot of people, something to lament because it represented a significant deterioration in their influence. Even though by the 1980s, the standard of living in the Soviet Union was way behind Western Europe, of course, at the same time, there was full employment. So it was a powerful country, people were employed. So it's not too difficult to imagine a Russian who's struggled for decades, looking back fondly at the Soviet Union. Of course, there are a lot of rich Russians, as we all know about, the oligarchs, but that disguises the full picture, that there's also a significant level of poverty there as well. So yes, that's very true. There is, one example of that is if you think about how Gorbachev is a figure that we perhaps revere in the West, is widely despised in Russia. He's not seen as the man who brought peace to the world. He's often, obviously I'm generalizing, there are different perspectives in Russia, but he's often viewed as the man who essentially ruined what was a pretty successful country. So that's, it's a very good point. And finally, prestige, which is linked to what I've just said. Many Russians view that they lost prestige on the world stage. And certainly in the 1990s, they did go into decline. They were essentially ruled by an alcoholic in Yeltsin, and they had this economic turmoil of privatization, which, caused quite a bit of chaos and essentially created the oligarchs. And, there's a long-standing Russian theme of wanting to be taken seriously. We can see that, for example, manifested in, trying to achieve sporting success, perhaps, of course, going too far, as we've seen with doping scandals, or, being seen to be at the cutting edge of science, wanting to, to be seen to be playing an important role in the, campaign against COVID. But of course, a lot of these are very traditional things. And just to sort of illustrate that clearly, we go all the way back to Peter the Great many centuries ago, often, revered as the kind of father of Russia. Essentially, a lot of what we're talking about in terms of understanding Putin today is not that different to the kinds of things that were preoccupying the political head of Russia many centuries ago. On his deathbed, apparently, Peter the Great stated this to his successors as a sort of, watchword for the future: approach as near as possible to Constantinople in India. Constantinople is Istanbul today. Whoever governs there will be the true sovereign of the world. So he was preoccupied with the need for Russia to expand. So again, even though, we think, well, Russia's a big country, there's always been this kind of desire. We need to be as big as possible. We need a buffer zone. We need to be as big as possible. We need to be able to access these warm water ports. We need to be able to defend ourselves against the West. So there's a defensive kind of mindset which has always underpinned Russian foreign policy. And perhaps we do need to understand in the context of the current situation. And a great point was raised in the question there earlier that, in some ways, we can say Putin was waiting for the opportunity to do this. Opportunism is also something which seems to characterize Russian foreign policy. So it's not a sudden thing. It seems quite sudden. And I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers here. I was telling my students I didn't think they would invade. So I'm not pretending I'm an oracle on all things here. But in a way, it isn't all that surprising. Even under Yeltsin in the 90s, his foreign minister Primakov was talking about the need to do the kinds of things that we're now seeing. Establish a sphere of influence, extend prestige, enhance a kind of Russian perspective on the world, Eurasianism, kind of idea of a kind of Russian exceptionalism as a country that spans Europe and Asia. The difference was in the 90s, the Russians weren't in a position to be able to do this. But as was pointed out in the question earlier, recognizing that perhaps the West was weak, the Americans pulling out and other countries pulling out of Afghanistan, economic turmoil, Brexit, all of these things perhaps presented an opportunity for the Russians to do what they'd wanted to do for some time, which is to reassert or attempt to reassert themselves in Ukraine. Okay, so in conclusion then, is there a new Cold War? Well, essentially what I'm saying is, of course, it's up to you. It's not a case of me telling you yes or no. For realists, if there is a new Cold War, they would, of course, welcome this, given again what we talked about earlier, because a Cold War implies balance. In the early 90s, Mearsheimer, who I mentioned earlier, famously said, "We will soon miss the Cold War." In other words, the Cold War was a good thing. The world was safer when there was a Cold War because there was a balance of power. Liberals wouldn't see it that way and would be very alarmed at the prospect of a new Cold War and pin their hopes to the fact that maybe through sanctions and through pressure, Russia will be weakened and the rule of law can reassert itself. And so maybe out of this will come a possibility of a strengthening of law and international cooperation. But of course, to a large extent, we just have to wait and see. Okay, we've got a question here, which I'll just address, and if any of you have any other questions, I'm happy to take that for the last few minutes. So Christos has made the point, watching international developments within the frame of the Ukrainian invasion by Russia. I noticed that yesterday, US Foreign Secretary and Defense Ministers visited Kyiv and Zelensky. In their comments after the meeting, where they looked frustrated, I realized they spread what I believe lies. They stated that Putin pledged to subjugate the whole of Ukraine, something that he did not. Is this some kind of false flag? Will legitimate NATO to send Polish or other troops into Ukraine? What's an interesting point, and certainly some would see it that way. Personally, I don't think it's a false flag. I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the West are keen not to confront Russia if they can possibly help it. But as I indicated, that's one perspective, and that there are others on this, and certainly that's a view that you're not alone in having. On Matteo, can we say the involvement of Russia in the Syrian wars because Russia wants to expand their sphere of influence in the Middle East? Absolutely, yes. I think we can say that. The point I made earlier about a warm water port comes into play here as well. Of course, as a payoff, if you like, for lending their support to Assad in Syria, the Russians have secured a port on the Mediterranean in Syria. So yes, it's given them a foothold in, of course, that strategically important area of the Middle East where they haven't really had a foothold before. So yes, that very much fits in with the kind of logic that I've been discussing. Sarah, would you say that USSR tensions started all the way back in 1917? Yeah, I mean, I'm not unsympathetic to that kind of argument, because there's little doubt that there is evidence that the US and other Western countries like Britain were hostile to Bolsheviks from the start. They felt inherently threatened by the nature of communism. So yes, undoubtedly there were tensions there. Of course, they overcame them for the Second World War because they had to. As Churchill said, "I will do a deal with the devil if that's what's required to defeat the Nazis," when people questioned why the British were getting close to the Soviet Union. Sarah's also asked, what school of Cold War historians do you agree with? It's a good question. I'm not meaning to sit on the, anyone who knows me, I don't generally, but I'm genuinely, I've never been entirely convinced. I suppose if I had to pin my colors on one of them, even though I'm not a realist, I think the post-revisionists have a point, that I think the level of change in power in the world meant that there would be this kind of, power collision. But in terms of specifically allocating blame, I think that, let's be clear, from my view, there's no doubt that Stalin's Soviet Union was a horrific place. And I think, it was important to try and challenge that, at least in some way. In line with what was argued earlier, I do think there has been anti-communist and anti-Russian sentiment around for a long time. I think we do need to at least understand that. So, I'm not unsympathetic with that kind of perspective. Are there any other questions? So Sarah, again, are there any other nations who influence the balance of power in the current Ukraine? Yeah, it's an interesting point. Of course, go back to Mearsheimer. He's on record as saying that Ukraine should never have given up the atomic bomb, because at the end of the Cold War, some of the Soviet arsenal was actually in Ukraine. And in that context, there is the argument that would have been enough to deter the Russians. Whether that's true is questionable, but in terms of the present situation, well, the balance, the fact that, I mean, the realists will argue the fact that the Soviets have done this is indicative that there isn't a balance. Now, of course, NATO is a counter to Russia, and that's why, in response to the previous question, I don't think NATO are spoiling for war here. I think, you know, they are just there to deter Russians getting involved in somewhere like Poland or the Baltic states. So the fact that there is a war is the fact that the Russians have not been balanced in this regard. However, I think what has also become apparent is the balance between Ukraine and Russia is not what we imagined. Okay, I think most people widely assumed that this would be very straightforward for Russia, but of course it's proving not to be the case. Again, perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised by this. You know, if we look back historically, you know, the Vietnamese defeated the Americans, the Afghans defeated, well, the Americans, the Soviets, the British, you know, so countries can defend themselves. You know, normal balance of power calculations don't always come into the equation. Okay, thank you very much. There's some really excellent questions there. Okay, so a couple more coming up. Nicole's asked, not related to the Ukraine crisis, Nicole, but do you have any podcast, documentary, book trying to study international politics? Yeah, I mean, as I say, I've written my own stuff, which I'd be happy to sort of send you some examples of. I can send you some reading lists of stuff that we use on the course. The Cold War, again, there are BBC, for example, has a very good site on the Cold War if you wanted to have a look at that. So yeah, Christos, thank you for that. That's very nice of you. Darina, Moldova, yeah, it's a very good question. A lot of people are very alarmed about the prospect of Moldova sort of coming into the frame. Just to be clear, those of you who don't know, Moldova borders Ukraine. It's essentially ethnically a Romanian country, but it's a sort of chunk of Romania that the Soviets sliced off during the Second World War. And the Russians have an area, an enclave within their Transnistria. So yes, I wouldn't like to speculate, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Russians reasserted themselves in Moldova. And there's also talk that if they were to be successful from their point of view in the south of Ukraine, they could actually link up to Moldova through the south of Ukraine. Yeah, negotiation, Amateus made a good point. Yeah, I mean, this is the point that we can make. A realist will say, well, you know, it's only confrontation and threats that can create peace, but a liberal will make that point that at the end of the day, whatever we think about the war, it's political. It's because of political differences. Ukraine wanting to assert themselves as a sovereign state, the Russians feeling that Ukraine is not a normal sovereign state. It has a special relationship with the Russians. Yeah, you know, maybe, again, it's easy with hindsight, but maybe going back, this could have been resolved through dialogue, maybe. Sarah, Yugoslavia. Yeah, it's an interesting one, the Yugoslavia question. It is surprising with hindsight that they were able to act so independently of the Soviet Union. I mean, it doesn't fit the normal understanding of, as I say, of balance of power and deterrence, because of course, you know, they would have been no match for Stalin's Soviet Union if he'd so chosen. But I think he took a view that as long as Yugoslavia weren't fully aligned with the West, they were okay. They were far enough away from the Soviet Union to, if you like, be on the kind of fringes of their sphere of influence in a different way, a bit like Finland, not officially part of the Western Pact, but in a kind of a buffer zone between there. Okay, well, thank you for listening. As I say, feel free to email me if you have any other questions about the course or about what I've talked about today. Angeline, did you want to round things off?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say a big thank you to you, Peter, for your time. It was a very informative and insightful lecture, and as we can tell from the Q&A, there was a lot of thoughts about it as well. So thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who came, and I hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much. And I do mean it. If you want to email me about the course or about what I've talked about today, feel free. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.